So for today's talk, I'm going to argue that key features of the Cypro-Minoan writing system cannot be understood without reference to single sign text, and in particular to a subset of single sign text, the Cypro-Minoan Potmarks. Instead of using the traditional terminology of Potmark, however, I'm going to use the terminology of a single sign vessel text, because at the heart of this study is a comparison between the Potmarks, aka the single sign vessel text, and multi-sign text, often referred to as inscriptions in Aegean script studies. In my experience, the terminology of Potmark and inscription, used idiosyncratically as they are in a lot of ancient script studies, is awkward and non-descriptive for wider audiences. But if it is confusing, I'd also really love that feedback too. So let's see how it goes. This is my first time using it in this type of setting. Using the term single sign text and multi-sign text also avoids the pitfalls of the term inscription that I believe it was Helen Strudwick pointed to the other day during the Q&A session, where we sometimes say something is inscribed when it's painted or, otherwise simply just written. I'm going to use the term single sign text to refer to a text on any media. In Cypro-Minoan context, single sign texts appear on a wide range of objects, from anchors to architectural stones to loom weights and so on. They remain understudied. The single sign vessel texts, aka the Potmarks, are a subset of the single sign texts. They number anywhere from around 1,000 to 1,500. The term text here is used in the contemporary sense of text me, which includes letters, numbers, all manner of other signs, and even pictograms like emojis. The single sign vessel texts contain a mix of signs borrowed from the script, complex marks with no phonetic values that we know of, and simple geometric marks. The vast majority are incised or painted post-firing. The most reasonable interpretation of the text proposed by Nicole Hirschfeld is that they are somehow linked to mercantile activity, whether tied to the distribution of the vessels or their contents, or the individuals or the groups handling them. But the precise function of the text, any patterns in their distribution or interrelationships between the script signs and the non-script sign text, awaits further study dependent upon an assembled corpus of all the single sign texts. Today's talk will focus on the single sign vessel text containing only script signs to interrogate their relationship to the multi-sign text. The earliest list of Cypro-Minoan texts, from the first compiled in 1915 by Menelaus Markiles to Olivier Maisson's 1957 list, included the single signs. The current authoritative list of Cypro-Minoan texts, Ho Chi Minh, published by Olivier in 2003, and Silvia Ferrara's CM2 corpus, published in 2013, exclude them. The distinction that both Olivier and Ferrara make is between multi-sign texts, whose signs are approximately contiguous and on the same plane, which they count as inscriptions, and single sign texts, which are deemed not inscriptions. The reasoning here is that contiguous multi-sign texts necessarily record writing in the form of polysyllabic words, since we're dealing with a syllabary. By contrast, single sign texts may or may not be writing, as they could be non-phonetic marks adapted into a marking system from the script. This is the definition of an inscription used in most every Aegean scripts corpora, with the exception of the Inscriptiones Graecae, published by Perna, Karnava, and Eggetmeyer for the Cypro-syllabic script that I just mentioned. So this was just published this past year, and it's the first Inscriptiones Graecae, to the best of my understanding, to include single sign text, and then also the first Aegean scripts corpora. Olivier describes his choice to exclude single sign text as a matter of convenience. He writes, "For the opposite would have forced me to include hundreds of isolated signs on vases, which was materially impossible." Ferrara excludes them on the grounds that they are probably not writing, including only 4 single sign texts in her corpus. One she believes safely, quote, records a phonogram, 2 identical texts, which she thinks may record a logogram, and one that she includes for its interests. A person consulting either corpus cannot readily understand the magnitude and variety of single sign texts from Cypro-Minoan context, nor that they may record phonograms. Although Ferrara states that her goal was never to assemble a traditional corpus of inscriptions, quote, not aspiring to be a conventional corpus strictu sensu, but to outline the anatomy of Cypro-Minoan objects by developing a narrative of their archaeological life, her list of inscriptions and her decision to call that list a corpus nevertheless has the effect of canonizing that list of inscriptions as a traditional corpus would do. The boundaries that Ferrara and Olivier have drawn between the single sign and multi-sign texts creates the impression that the single sign texts don't have bearing on the study of the Cypro-Minoan script writing system and its underlying language, but the function of these single sign texts is far from resolved. The aim of today's paper is not to resolve the unresolvable, but to push back against the simple equation that multi-sign text equals words and single sign text don't equal words. And pushing that back on this equation, I'm not arguing for the inclusion of single sign text in future Cypro-Minoan corpora, as I think that ship has already sailed. The mechanics would just be too difficult. But rather, I want to show how studying the single sign and multi-sign text side by side can clarify idiosyncratic features of the Cypro-Minoan writing system obscured when the two types of texts are separated. In particular, I look at Cypro-Minoan abbreviation practices to show that there are at least two instances or two types of demonstrable cases in which single sign texts function as phonetic abbreviations of words. So besides the one that Ferrara has included, and it looks like, okay, I might have skipped ahead, that's all right. And two, that there are two sign texts where the two signs are contiguous and roughly the same signs that are not words. I will begin by looking at specific demonstrable cases of each of the two phenomenon, and then try to generalize the cases to all vessel texts. There are two cases in which two sign sequences should not be read as words. One, in the case where otherwise identical two sign sequences appear with and without stictograms. And here the term stictogram is a neutral term to refer to a non-phonetic marker that's probably functioning as some sort of abbreviation. And two, when an otherwise identical two sign sequence appears with interchangeable sign order on different texts of the same writing media. So when it reads XY and YX. Cypro-Minoan, by and large, has a fixed left to right writing order. So the reversibility of sign order is likely not a result of reversed writing direction, but rather the fact that the order of the two signs in question is not relevant to their meaning. There is only one scenario I have identified in which single sign text can demonstrably be shown to be phonetic abbreviations. There are, at minimum, 3 discrete examples where a single sign text is found together with a multi-sign text that bears the same sign as the abbreviation. So the multi-sign text reads X plus Y, for example, and the single sign text Y. The shared archaeological context in these cases makes it A, very likely that the single sign text is an abbreviation, and 2, that it has the same referent as the abbreviation in the multi-sign text. But first, how do we know that the multi-sign Cypro-Minoan sequences contain phonetic abbreviations? The multi-sign texts make frequent use of isolated signs demarcated by stictogram, sign position, or size. The communis opinio is that the isolated signs abbreviate words and are not logograms because they are largely non-repeating. The repertoire of isolated signs is fixed but large, and the isolated signs do not frequently recur on the same types of objects or in the same context as one would expect of a logogram. The 1+1 inscription type, so pictured here where you have a sign, a stictogram, and another sign, are generally regarded as the abbreviations, although there's no agreement on whether they abbreviate one word, as in the abbreviation for the word doctor, or 2 words. to the first signs of two different words. There is at least one case of a two-sign sequence that's generally regarded as an abbreviation and not a word, and that's of miniature Ingot 175. But generally speaking, two-sign texts are regarded as words, and that assumption is not usually questioned. The most convincing example of a Cypro-Minoan two-sign text recording an abbreviation and not a word is the case of miniature Ingot 175 and this top sequence here. So in your upper left-hand corner, it should be. It is one of 4 miniature ingots bearing multi-sign texts, 3 of which are included in Ferrara and Olivier's Corpora, and the 4th of which is unpublished, but which is recently put on exhibit at the City Museum in Nicosia. By happy coincidence, miniature Ingot 175 is not only the most convincing example of an abbreviation in a multi-sign Cypro-Minoan text, but the 4 ingots together exhibit both the criterion under which two-sign sequences should certainly be read as abbreviations and not words. The ingots contain an identical two-sign sequence, both with and without word dividers. And the one instance, our new ingot in the bottom right-hand corner, which contains the same two-sign sequence, but in interchangeable or reversed word order. And I will use a discussion of the ingots as a gateway to discuss some of the other examples we have of this. And because this guy is new, here's a nice up-close picture of him. So I got this in text from my friend Anna. It's like, have you seen this? And I was like, no, I haven't. But apparently Vasiliki Cassandra has looked at it and it appears to be authentic, at least from the time period. And it's now in the Leventis collection. Ingot 175 carries 2 sign sequences, one of which, the shorter 2-sign sequence. Oh, these lines got moved up. Well, you guys can sort of get the point, yes? Those colored lines should be underneath our slides. So the first 2 signs seem to abbreviate the first and the last sign of our longer sequence. Evidence that the 2-sign sequence is most definitely an abbreviation comes in the form of the other ingots. A 5th object bearing the same sign sequence is from Ugarit, and it is a commodity label, and it shows the 2 signs without a stictogram. And that 2-sign sequence too should be regarded as an abbreviation in light of the ingots. Without the other examples of the 3 ingots, the identical sequence on 175 and the label would be mistaken for a word, but with them it's clear that the 2 signs abbreviate the 5-sign sequence. Abbreviations of the first and last sign of a word are not attested in the contemporary linear or cuneiform writing systems to the best of my knowledge. But they are not unheard of in other systems, as mentioned in the example of the abbreviation of the word doctor, for instance. Another possibility is that the 2-sign abbreviation on Ingot 175 abbreviates the first signs of 2 different words. Based on the position, angle, and inscription method of the last 3 signs in the 5-sign sequence, it is possible that it may in fact contain 2 separate words, 10236 and 23-114-23. The last 3 signs are slightly offset from the first 2 and set at a different angle from them. Francesca Meneghetti, who undertook autopsy of the ingot, has observed in personal communication that the horizontal lines on that 4th sign, 114, are drawn in a different writing direction from that of the first 2 signs in the 2 sequences on top. Altogether, the differences could distinguish the last 3 signs as a separate word, although it doesn't have to be the case. But it's at least worth thinking about as a possibility. Aside from the miniature ingot, there are 2 other examples of 2-sign sequences appearing with and without stictograms, which I will discuss briefly. An example of a 2-sign sequence that appears with and without stictograms is the sequence 23-109. This sequence, 2-sign sequence, appears horizontally disposed on 2 separate handles from Kidian, 135 where we have a stictogram, and 139 without one. Olivier suggests that the stictogram is accidentally missing from 139, or maybe even obscured by that scratch there. But there's no compelling reason for that inference. This dictogram would have been longer than the scratch in question and probably would have left some remnant. And we have other examples of handle sequences from Chaldean without the stictogram, so they're not a necessary part of the sequences. Sequence 10206 is a second example that's repeated 3 to 4 times, but unlike in our other example, it occurs on different media, on different write-in media coming from different sites. The sequence appears once with the stictogram and 2 or 3 times without it. The 10206 sequence appears on the clay ball, twice on 2 different types of vessels, and once in a less than clear reading on a cylinder seal. The sequence with the stictogram is on clay ball 61. The 2 signed vessel texts, one on the base of a bowl and the other the interior of a crater, and this one in the form of a dipinti, don't have stictograms, but the positioning of the signs could be read as slightly offset from one another and perhaps demarcate the 2 signs as abbreviations. On the cylinder, the 2 signs are pressed up against one another, and there's no obvious attempt to demarcate the 2 sign sequence as an abbreviation. Seal 253 is a gray basalt cylinder seal with a 2 sign text incised horizontally. The text was not placed onto a prepared surface, but squeezed into an empty space within the image and was likely not original to the design. Valerio, who first proposed that the seal be given a corpus number, reads the second sign as CM 072, but admits that 06 or 68 are also plausible readings. There is no sign in the script with the exact same sign shape as what is pictured here on the seal. In Valerio's drawing on the left, for his 72 reading to work, even with the additional horizontal line that he reads at the top of the sign, 2 other additional lines would be needed. So one at the top and one at the side. As CM 10272 is not a sequence that's attested elsewhere in the corpus, and therefore is perhaps not the most likely reading. CM 06 makes better sense as a reading in terms of the sign shape, but also in the fact that we have the sequence attested elsewhere. If that reading is accepted, then we have the 10206 sequence attested 4 times, once with a word divider and 3 times without, and in 2 cases on the vessels where maybe separation is indicated by the position of the letters and maybe not. Either way, in all cases, I believe we should read the sequence as not single words, but as abbreviations. In addition to the miniature ingots already discussed, there are at least 3 sets of 2 sign sequences whose signs appear in interchangeable order, 2 of which will be discussed briefly. Unlike in the example of the miniature ingots, whose archaeological find contexts are unknown, the following examples are of texts that were found together. At Chaldean, 3 different texts, all incised bases of Mycenaean vessels of different shapes, contain the sequence CM 27 and 28, twice in the order 28-27, and once 27-28. Each of the 3 jugs comes from the same tomb and dates to the same LC3B context. The interchangeability and sign order of the text suggests that all 3 multi-sign texts refer to the same thing. Also from the same tomb, dating to the same level, is a vessel with CM 27 incised into its base, in this case a Mycenaean bull. It is reasonable then to infer, on analogy with the 2 sign texts, that the single sign text on the bull base is A, an abbreviation, and B refers to the same thing as the other texts. The same phenomenon is seen on tin ingots from the Hishuley Carmel shipwreck. These 4 ingots are not included in Olivier or Ferrara's Corpora, but otherwise meet the definition of inscriptions. They contain the 2 sign sequence, CM 19 and CM 82. 2 of the ingots contain the sign order 1982 and 2 the order 8219. In addition, there is another ingot from the same shipwreck. It's hard to see the sign on the picture that we have from Galilee and the excavators, but it's pictured there, and the sign is all the way up at the very top. That carries the CM19 sign. The interchangeability of the sign order on the tin ingots suggests that the 2 sign sequences is an abbreviation and not a word. The ingot with the same single sign should therefore also be read as a phonetic abbreviation. The archaeological context shared by all 5 objects, the 4 2-sign texts and the single sign text, adds weight to the suggestion that the sequences are related to one another and likely refer to the same thing. Beyond the specific examples discussed above, in which cases I think it's demonstrable that we're dealing with abbreviations, both in the case of the 2-sign sequences and the single sign text, I believe it's possible to make and defend a generalizing claim that the single sign text and 2-sign text on vessels should both be read as abbreviations. I say this is a generalizing claim because I don't think it is possible, except in the circumstances outlined above, to select a specific text and say whether or not it records a phonogram or a mark or a word or an abbreviation. Most of our texts simply just don't have enough information for us to say that. But the similarities in the material features of the multi-sign and single sign vessel texts mean that they likely share the same function. The multi-sign and single sign vessel texts are very similar to one another in their writing media, i.e. the vessel types that they select, the placement and orientation of the text on the vessels, and their archaeological context. The single sign and multi-sign texts likely have the same function as one another on that case. As Philippa Steele has said, the distinction between the multi-sign and single sign vessel texts, quote, in terms of understanding the function and context of such inscriptions is entirely a false one. For the multi-sign vessel text, it is possible to identify a repertoire of isolated signs that are used as abbreviations. The abbreviated signs are demarcated either by stictograms or by their size or their placement. Moving from the known to the unknown, we can compare the repertoire of signs used as abbreviation in the multi-sign text to the repertoires of signs on the 2-sign and single sign text to see if they carry the same signs. Of the 13 signs used as abbreviations in multi-sign texts, all but 1 is attested in the repertoire of 2-sign texts, which consists of 34 signs. Given the mismatch in the number of signs in the repertoires in question, the comparison is not all that meaningful, though it certainly does not contradict the suggestion that the 2-sign texts might be abbreviations. Shifting to the single sign texts, when its repertoire of 38 signs is compared to the 13 signs used as an abbreviation, we see all 13 multi-sign text abbreviations in the single sign text repertoire. The overlap in signs is suggestive, but not necessarily convincing, given the small number of signs used as abbreviations. When the repertoire of signs used as abbreviations in the multi-sign vessel text is combined with this 2-sign text under the hypothesis that the 2-sign text might contain abbreviations, we have 35 signs to work with in our comparison, enough to make a more meaningful comparison. Of the 35 signs, 31 are attested in the 38 signs in the single sign vessel text repertoire. I entered these numbers into a statistical equation that is used to compare the identity of 2 distinct but potentially related populations. According to this equation comparing 2 populations, the proportion of signs shared between the single sign vessel text and the multi-sign text is statistically significant. There's an 88% chance that the two repertoires of signs represent a single population of signs. This comparison is more evidence in support of the suggestion made above that the two sign vessel texts contain abbreviations and not words, and that the single sign vessel texts contain the same phonetic abbreviations as the multi-sign text. Turning to the single sign text alone for a second, I wanted to briefly touch on another line of evidence for the claim that their texts contain phonetic abbreviations. The Cypro-Minoan signs that appear in the single sign text as compared to the signs not selected or used in the single sign vessel text record a high proportion of word initial and common signs. The inverse is also the case. So of the signs that are in the non-Potmark text, so that we don't see the single sign text makers select, 66% are either never initial or rarely initial. This is high compared to the multi-sign text signery overall, where the proportion of signs that are either rarely word initial or never word initial is cumulatively 10% lower. Looking at the Potmark repertoire, there's only one sign in the whole of the single sign vessel text repertoire that is never used word initially. Curiously, it is also the only Potmark sign that is exclusive to the CM2 tablets. It is tested on a single Potmark, which is a rare before firing handle text. The rest of the signs in the single sign text repertoire are all attested in word initial use and could therefore potentially abbreviate words. Abbreviations, more likely than not, arise in response to a word's heavy usage. For an abbreviation to be recognized, it should abbreviate a word in common use. Rare signs, identified or defined rather as any sign attested fewer than 10 times, comprise 30% of the multi-sign text signery. By contrast, 50% of the signs that are not used in the Potmarks are rare signs. This proportion is significantly higher than that of the number of rare signs in the single sign text. The relatively low proportion of non-word initial and rare signs in the single sign text repertoire adds further evidence to the arguments adduced above that the single sign vessel text on the whole likely abbreviate words. How the single sign vessel text with script signs relate to the text with non-phonetic marks is a question for further study. They are most likely part of one, not separate marking systems based on the similarities in their vessel type, text placement, and archaeological context. This observation extends to the two-sign vessel text as well. The boundaries between the single sign vessel text with script signs, single sign vessel text with non-script signs, and the multi-sign vessel text are porous. The instances of multi-sign and single sign text from the same archaeological context that we looked at strongly suggest not only that in these cases, the single sign texts refer to the same things as their multi-sign texts, but also that the same person or persons made them. As argued today, this claim might be generalizable to all the multi-sign and single sign vessel texts, that they have the same reference and were made by the same groups of people. Presenting the information in this way and concentrating on the single sign text with signs in the script flattens out the picture to a certain extent. But I hope that I've convincingly shown that the division between the multi-sign and single sign text obscures rather than illuminates the interconnections between vessel texts and their makers.